For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Batend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we talk to cannabis leaders from across the industry. We talk to politicians, CEOs, farmers, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. The cannabis industry has a diversity problem. In many states, the owners of cannabis businesses are disproportionately white, affluent, and male. Take Illinois. Despite specific policies that were intended to bring equity to communities that were disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, 6 months later, the city of Chicago still doesn't have a single Black-owned dispensary. Ariel Clark is an attorney in California who focuses on the cannabis industry. She got her start back in 2008 when she co-founded her law firm, Clark & Howell, and since then she's served as the chair of the Los Angeles Cannabis Task Force. She's represented many people seeking cannabis licenses both inside and outside of the social equity label in California. Today, we're talking about some of the recent changes to California's social equity program, some of the stuff that's been going on in Illinois, and how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted efforts across the country. Ariel, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have been called one of the architects of the cannabis industry, and I want to go back to the beginning, the foundation, to stick with the metaphor. What inspired you to get into this line of work and become a cannabis lawyer, as it were?
Ooh, I love a good origin story. Thank you for asking the question. Okay, well, it all begins with my parents, and very sincerely. Yeah, so I'm biracial. I'm half Native American, Ottawa from the Grand Traverse Band of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Michigan, and half white. And my father was very actively involved in the American Indian movement and other political social justice reform movements. My mother also very involved in political reform, both of whom were involved in the cannabis trade back in the day. And I'll leave it there. I've always kind of had this intersection point of cannabis as a plant, as a medicine, as something that is both medicinal and recreational in my life, as well as a desire to see the status quo change in ways that it must and necessarily will. So, since I was very young, I was also very involved in social justice, policy reform issues. I started a student court in my high school and many number of things. So just kind of very action oriented in that we build the world and the life we want to see, and we actively participate in that with others. And that can absolutely happen and has been an incredible opportunity to be involved in really the legalization, normalization, regulation of cannabis, because it dovetails with so many other aspects of our lives, including social justice issues, including, access to capital and creativity around being an entrepreneur for all sorts of people across the board. So, it's the through line is sort of that coming together of this incredible plant that can make so many things. I mean, there's even all of the discussion around hemp and textiles and everything, this comes from the earth. And then our relationship to it. And as an attorney, we help create, if we are so engaged, the framework around that emerging industry, how that will interplay in society, culturally, with business, with government. So that's my origin story.
Would you say that, I'm sure that some of the particulars are different, but are you in some ways kind of playing in that world that you were hoping to build back when you were starting student courts?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. I mean, part of it is this. So when I was young, and I grew up we had very little money, and we didn't have a place to live at different times. And I lived in a van at different times. And, it was a very non-traditional upbringing. And I didn't know any other lawyers or certainly judges growing up, or people who were actually in the establishment. We were very, very outside of the establishment. But it was from that vantage point seeing, okay, we don't have the ability to sort of, or at least I certainly didn't feel I had the ability to navigate within that establishment, and kind of help protect, create. Yeah, really, I think about it almost like navigating through a matrix, right? So I wanted to understand what those rules were. And I didn't necessarily think at the time, okay, I want to understand those rules so I can also, for lack of a better term, manipulate them or create them. But that's absolutely, what it has ended up being. And as part of that process, when you are on these, with these certain very emerging markets, being very actively engaged in the rule lawmaking, policy, cultural process is great lawyering, great advocacy. It's bigger than lawyering. It's actually being, kind of much more engaged on a meta level.
I think it's interesting, and you kind of, I think, spoke in some ways to what I'm going to ask here, but you mentioned the word protect, and that, the legal side of this stuff was sort of a mystery. And I'm not assuming that there's anything threatening inherently about a mystery, but something that is ununderstandable can be unpredictable. And so I think it's interesting that protection is one of the words that you mentioned. Like, you could have gone into public service, you could have gone into any number of different avenues, I suppose, to affect change. Why did you see law as the avenue that you wanted to pursue?
I think that some things are just the inspired path. I was very naive in what being a lawyer was and going to law school was. When I went to law school at Berkeley, when I was on my way to get in the car and drive across the country to go to law school, my mom was very concerned that I would end up like those people. I remember she called me then years later when we were about to pass the state medical marijuana regulation and safety act in California. And she said, "Oh my goodness, Ariel, I just realized, does this mean you're going to be a corporate lawyer someday?" So it was not something that was, being a lawyer, understanding kind of what that all involved was not something that was spoken of at the dinner table. I just sort of had this sense that there could be justice there. There were people who needed help and to sort of be included in dominant culture systems that were not. And, when at Berkeley, that was sort of this inception point of the cannabis industry. And so I had a lot of friends who were involved in the space who were growing and, kind of involved with dispensaries and understanding, especially in California back in, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, how are you legal? That was before rules and regulations and agencies existed. That was when we had this nonprofit collective model with very measly protections where businesses, which you didn't even call them a business at the time, you called them a collective of patients, where they would operate on a nonprofit basis, but that was only a defense to criminal prosecution. And I clicked in so deeply with working with and on behalf of and protecting people who were growing, selling, manufacturing, distributing cannabis in a very uncertain legal environment, advising them not as a criminal lawyer, but as business regulatory, which I know was very far out there. I had, people say, "You are crazy. You have a law degree from Berkeley Law. What are you doing?" And I also didn't tell people what I did. But it was the ability to understand the rules and also where there were no rules and what did it look like practically out in the world and what were the enforcement patterns. So it's like there are ways to be a good lawyer that is not just practicing law. It is, again, I really do think it's a hawk's eye meta perspective. There are a number of factors that go into how can these people continue to do what they're doing? How can we continue to, move this conversation forward? And also, what does that conversation mean? What is cannabis? What does it give to us? What can it look like within our communities? Like, what are we doing? And then how can we do it in a thoughtful way? Understanding how policy and policy reform works and the sort of grinding gears of the political systems, which are pretty wild.
You've been there for a lot of the conversations on many of the topics that you've mentioned. And before we get into kind of the current moment and where we are right now, I'm curious, how did you and your partner meet, and kind of where do they come into the story?
Sure. So my partner, Nicole Howell, and I met in Joshua Tree about 8 or 9 years ago on a yoga retreat. And I fell in love with her immediately. And the feeling was definitely mutual. And I asked her, at the time she was working at a big law firm. And I had my own solo shop with my shingle thrown up here in LA, and she was in the Bay Area. And just from day one, I told her she should leave that big firm and come be with me. It took a couple years, and I remember the phone call on a Saturday morning. I was living in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, and she said, Ariel, I'm finally ready. And it was just such a beautiful moment because, to be a firm that is owned and run by women, and not just and women with a sort of new paradigm of femininity and feminism, and a much more egalitarian approach versus the old paradigm of male dominated or masculine dominated, right? So it's less about kind of gender and more about sort of ethos and orientation, sort of like an inner place, has been an incredible creative experience. And we are very thoughtful about how we do everything, how we work with clients, how we work with the wonderful, brilliant attorneys who work for us and with us and other folks, how we engage on issues. So, for us, we are running a law firm, but also we are very engaged in policy issues. We do a ton of pro bono work. We have a variety of initiatives that we're regularly working on because we are engaged humans who care a lot about how we show up in this life. Being a great lawyer, 100%. Having a successful law firm and helping people build very successful businesses, absolutely. And also, we can have that and other things too. It's the conception of conscious capitalism and living at the nexus point of for good and for profit. And really looking ahead in creating a world that has to look different than, what has been. And so, having the opportunity to really work very closely with such a brilliant person and so many other brilliant people it is one of the greatest gifts of my life, for sure.
You've been named the top 5 cannabis law firms by Entrepreneur. You were top 75 most important women in cannabis from Cannabis Business Executive, 30 most powerful cannabis lawyers. Does that feel like validation at all?
It's very kind. It's very kind. It feels like it's nice to be seen, I suppose. Yeah, that's nice. It's the accolades. Yeah, that's very kind. I've spent, I care very, very deeply about what I do and how I show up, and integrity and participating again in this world in this short time that I am present here is very meaningful to me. So yeah, it's one of the wonderful qualities of living in a very engaged way.
So let's move on a little bit here to kind of some of the current difficulties that the cannabis industry is facing, and maybe some of the things that you're currently looking or your clients are dealing with. One of the long-running frictions, shall we say, has been between the cannabis industry and banks, who are often unsure where or how or if they're willing at all to work with cannabis. I'm just curious if that's something that you see any movement on in the near future, or if you think that it's just something that we are going to have to wait till federal legalization before people get more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and a consistent challenge. I mean, think about all of the issues that lack of access to banking brings. It's, lack of access to capital. It's a health and safety issue for communities. It's incredibly inefficient for businesses. The list goes on. So, we know all the problems, and advocates in the space have tried a number of different solutions to looking at this issue. My partner was involved, and our firm sat on this working group that we had in California about 3 years ago that the then treasurer, John Chang, put together. And there were a number of hearings across the state talking about the banking issue. And ultimately it was, putting together a state chartered bank in California has a number of issues. And, ultimately the linchpin is exactly what you point out, which is needing cannabis to be rescheduled. The frustrating point is that, when FinCEN came out with their guidance to banks in 2014, one would have thought that would have motivated banks a bit more. And given the very few issues any banks have had who follow the specific marijuana suspicious activity report requirements and know your customer requirements, one would think that there would be more opportunities for banking. There really are not still. And I do think that it's going to take federal action and a change in the scheduling of marijuana probably to fix that issue. That being said, we will continue to come at that issue from a variety of vantage points. One being that it inhibits efforts for social equity businesses to have opportunities to access capital. And it's now, it really is a social equity, social justice issue. It's shocking to me that the public health and safety issue was not enough of a compelling one to create a fix. But, we will certainly continue at it. I wish I had better news.
No, I think that's one of those things. This has been a years-long fight, which does kind of lead us into one of the last sort of sections or topics that I wanted to kind of talk to you about, which is the social equity question when it comes to ownership and who's profiting off of this nascent industry. I'm located here in Chicago, and Illinois was at first lauded quite a lot, and people still say that it's a good example of a state that really tried to, it seems, work social equity policies into the way that they rolled out legal cannabis. That being said, it just didn't necessarily work out all that effectively, and we have a situation where by far the majority of the owners in Illinois are white. So before we get into kind of Illinois and what's going on here, I'm curious, about a month ago, there were some changes to California's policy, if I'm not mistaken. Can you kind of just broadly recap what's going on with California's social equity?
So in California, the way to open a cannabis business is that you have to have local approval before you can take that local approval and submit it to the state to get your essentially license to operate the business. Broadly in California, we still have prohibition in nearly 80% of the state because very few local jurisdictions are issuing business licenses. That's very unfortunate. So broadly, we have many unregulated, unlicensed operators across California. And now there is an effort and budget money being given to enforce against these unregulated, quote unquote, illicit operators. That being said, it's really challenging because there's enforcement without real opportunity. And that absolutely plays into these conversations around social equity in California, because the bar financially and otherwise to getting a business license to operate a regulated business is immensely high. It's incredible. In these local jurisdictions, they'll issue a couple licenses. Actually, all of this. This is how it is in Illinois, I believe. So when it comes to social equity, we've got about 9 local jurisdictions that have social equity programs. The state has dedicated about $40 million to help fund these programs. And Oakland was the first city to really roll out a social equity program. LA is obviously has followed suit and created its own program. And we've got some other local jurisdictions. Each of these social equity programs look kind of different. In Los Angeles, in Oakland, in all of these jurisdictions, sounds like similar to Illinois, it's not perfect. And I guess I just want to say here that just because a thing is not perfect right now, it doesn't look exactly the way that we imagine it should look, does not mean we should give up on figuring out ways to effectuate the policy behind it. So, as you mentioned, for example, Illinois and kind of the makeup of the license holders, I hope very much that there are people who are thinking about other ways to benefit those who are fit within social equity qualifications, or communities that have been impacted most by the war on drugs, whether that's community reinvestment dollars or employment practices, or, kind of continuing to move that ball forward. And, that's something that we're dealing with in California, which is these programs, these are very tip of the spear issues. I mean, my God, we're talking about cannabis plus social equity. Neither has been done like this before. And then you put them together and you've got bureaucracy, and do you have the buy-in? And, there's many, many issues, but complicated issues, that's life. That's what this looks like. So, the encouragement is it's not perfect, so keep trying to fix it. Mm-hmm.
On that front, I think it's worth just kind of like laying bare some of the issues and sticking points that maybe are stopping progress. I mean, as an example, in Chicago, I think 600 of 700 current applicants for dispensary licenses do qualify. In that case, though, the criteria that, makes someone a social equity applicant is based on previous drug arrests, or having living in an area that maybe was, like you mentioned, adversely affected by the war on drugs. And in some ways, we're clearly trying to correct for outcomes that have come from sort of systemic racism and that have targeted specific people. But part of the problem is that there are concerns about creating laws that specifically benefit a specific group, correct? Like, we have to be kind of careful about how we fix the problem. Is that fair to say?
Well, here's the thing. We had a legal system and a political system that has been immensely violent toward certain groups of people. So, from my mind, it is just fine for a political and legal system to create laws that address and acknowledge those historical facts. How is it that we are able to heal really as a community? And in my mind, a community is each of us. We are all, when one is hurting, we are all hurting. And I recognize that conceptual idea of interconnectedness is one that is, maybe not from sort of dominant culture vantage point, but it is how I was raised, and it's my viewpoint on things. So if there is one group that has been immensely harmed by laws and policy, we need to create mechanisms to benefit that community and those groups. I'm a big fan of community reinvestment and also, again, thinking about other out of the box ways to create opportunities. What is that? Does that necessarily mean ownership in cannabis, in the cannabis business? Maybe not. I mean, I don't know. We have to think big, but it is always the case when we are in these emerging moments, and especially in these moments of crossroads, that we really can have aspirational ideas and move toward those ideas. So I know your first question was, do we need to be careful in some way as we're passing these laws and regulations? I don't know if you want to kind of pull that apart more, but my sort of thought is, yes, we need to be careful to acknowledge what has been and what is, and make choices that will truly create changes. It is an old paradigm. It has to be an old paradigm of, it is just about me and my group, and it is this way of doing things. I mean, it's the COVID and this moment that we have been experiencing is an immense destabilization. And in moments of destabilization, and when one is disconcerted, that is when it's all cracked open and the foundation is broken under us. That's when we can pick up the pieces and start to create something new. So I hope very much that you have big, wide, creative thinkers and people of much action in Illinois and in Chicago.
I do think that my question was kind of soft. I think like what I was trying to delicately ask was like, why can't we just fix the problem when we kind of know what it is, both historically and in a current context. And what you were just saying about coronavirus being a destabilizing moment, I want to bring this up because I know you're not an expert on Illinois, but I do think that I just love your gut level like reaction to this. Illinois was going to release an additional 75 licenses, and about 2 days before those licenses were about to come out, the governor actually postponed indefinitely their release and cited coronavirus as the reason. More specifically, they hadn't had an opportunity to like process those applications. Part of the commentary coming out of that is like, well, that's just going to keep Chicago's already majority white industry white for even longer. It also kind of, I think there's a question there when you have so many people out of work and cannabis is an essential service. I guess I'm just wondering, how does that strike you kind of on a gut level?
That sounds like total bullshit to me. Because the other thing that happens that I'm sure everyone has also recognized through the coronavirus is that when a thing needs to happen, when a government wants to make a choice, a governing body wants to make a choice to do a thing, it will do that thing. So this idea of, and I've come across this many times before, of some body of government or law saying, yeah, I'm sorry, we just can't possibly do that. Don't tell me that people are not employed and working at home who can't process these applications. We have figured it out in the city of LA, the Department of Cannabis Regulation. They answer the phone at home. We are taking calls. They are processing things here. It is not far afield for people to work in their homes and process the applications. There are inspections that are happening where they are being done virtually. That is also possible. So the thing is, do you want to approach it from a solution-oriented way or not? Clearly, there are folks there who don't want that approached in a solution-oriented way. And the major frustration, I'm sure, and real just heartbreak about that is that will absolutely, like when you have, it is access to the market now. It is the ability to get into the space, to build up your brand, to figure it all out, to be in the market so you can generate revenue and jobs and create some semblance of, I don't know, just like the ability to live in the world. I mean, if anyone thinks maybe in Illinois, because of the number of licenses, people are getting enormously wealthy off of cannabis. But I can tell you in California, the regulated market, it is challenging. But that's what it looks like when you don't create a monopoly. So, I
Ha.
hope, I hope
Well, you nailed it, because I was going to ask. I mean, we functionally have a monopoly. When you have a system where the number of licenses keeps dispensaries geographically spread out so far that your options, especially for medical patients who can't potentially travel or for whom travel is not, a first option. I've heard people talk about, I don't like my dispensary, but I'm stuck at it. And that is functionally a monopoly, right?
100,000,000%. And people in Illinois need to get together and push back against that. That is exactly the situation that we had, for example, in the city of Los Angeles, which was the inception point for me starting the LA Cannabis Task Force. We had a limited number of businesses that actually were about to pass a local set of rules that would have locked down their monopoly. And no way. Absolutely not. What happened? We need to have a free market and opportunities for entrepreneurs. Why is it that you are somehow this privileged and very special set? Again, that is this mentality of the haves and the have-nots. And I work so hard for it. We know enough now that people who are raised in families with a lot of money and access to capital and relationships and going to particular schools and having these relationships, that will absolutely be a definitive factor for their quote unquote success in life, much over and above children who are from homes where they do not have that and yet go to the same schools. So, it is the case that we need to have certain laws. That's why we're looking again at affirmative action, for example, in California, but why we need to have certain laws, and we who are voters and participating in the world as very active members, we need to come at this from a very different way, because ultimately what that looks like when we continue to allow the haves to have more and more and more and more is that our country will continue to look like Brazil, where there's an immensely poor people, so many people, and a very small middle class, and a very top of the most wealthy. And the thing is that it even actually is detrimental to those most wealthy because they're just desperately hanging on to what they have. It's a paradigm that does actually not serve us at all. And the only way that changes is not because very often those with all the stuff are willing to relinquish it. That is, a level of consciousness that is still living in the individuated level of consciousness. And only sometimes is there an actual awake recognition amongst folks who are caught in that having cycle that, wait, this is not just about me. This life is not just me alone. But, it may be, I don't know. I don't know where we're going as a human species. This is kind of these larger conversations of how we identify ourselves as individuals and in connection with others and the earth. So.
Absolutely. I'm really cognizant of your time here. We are running right up about we're running right into the end. We're running up about it. But I kind of a last thought as I was listening to you talk there. I mean, it strikes me that like public safety in a lot of ways is kind of how we got into this mess, right? Like the prohibition of cannabis in a lot of ways was based off of how this plant was going to be dangerous and destroy society. And in some ways, it feels like public safety, these delays in equity or these delays in agency or repealing prohibition are often kind of a new shade of a public safety concern. And so echoing back, I think a little bit to like my comment earlier about concern, we have to be careful or something like that. That is often used as like, that's the language sometimes that stops the progress, right?
Here's the thing. When lies are lies, they have to be called out. It is easy. You say things over and over again, and it's sometimes easy to be lulled into believing things that are lies, but That is not true. It is not true that there needs to be some magical number of 1,000 or 5,000 feet between dispensaries, because on some level that will help with public health and safety. If you read statistics about what happens in the local community with a regulated dispensary, the crime rates go down. If there's also corporate social responsibility and social equity involved, or requirements to hire transitional workers, you also have community-minded benefits in those areas. So those are just all lies that need to be called out. If they're said over and over, I get it. You start to believe it. Okay, I'm limited in this way. It can only be this way. And we start believing the limitations that are told to us. And the thing is, to every day, like really, really think, really be very awake to it. Is this true? Where does this come from? What does this actually serve? You have to, like, it is an inner connection that allows us to evaluate these outer stories that are told. So that all sounds like a made-up story that is being told where you're at, just like we have our own made-up stories that are limiting us and don't need to.
Ariel Clark is one of the founding partners at Clark & Howell. Ariel, thank you so much. I really, really appreciated the discussion.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground at TRICHOMES.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com or following us on all social media. The High Ground is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Batend. Thank you for listening.